Welcome to our deep dive, everybody. Today, we're tackling the two-quoque fallacy.
Oh, this is a good one.
It is. It's a classic. It's been used forever. It's basically like saying you two, trying to deflect criticism by pointing out hypocrisy in the other person.
Right, yeah, it's a distraction.
Exactly. Instead of actually addressing the argument, you're trying to shift the focus.
Yeah.
And we found some really interesting biblical examples of this, which we'll get into. So it's not just some modern day tactic. It's been around for ages.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, it really shows you how fundamental this kind of argument is, like how ingrained it is in human nature. It's like no matter what time period, you're going to find people using this.
Right. And it pops up in all sorts of situations, like in personal relationships, politics, you name it. But before we get too far, let's quickly define the two-quoque fallacy for our listeners. Essentially, it's about saying, you did it too, as a way to deflect from your own actions or arguments.
Yeah, it's a way of saying, look over there, instead of dealing with the issue at hand.
Exactly. It's like a magician's trick, misdirection, to get you looking somewhere else. And it can be really effective because it plays on our sense of fairness and justice. Like, if someone is accusing us of something and they've done the same thing themselves, it feels hypocritical, right?
Totally. And that hypocrisy can make us question their whole argument. But the problem is, it doesn't actually address the original issue.
Right. It's a distraction, and a pretty sneaky one at that. And that's what we're going to unpack in this deep dive. We'll look at some biblical examples, how this fallacy works, why it's problematic, and how we can deal with it effectively.
Absolutely. I think what's fascinating about looking at these biblical stories is that they're not just ancient history. They really offer timeless insights into human behavior.
Yeah, it's amazing how relevant they still are today, thousands of years later. Okay, so let's jump into our first example. The Pharisees and Jesus. Those guys were always at odds, weren't they?
Oh, yeah, constantly.
Always trying to trip him up, test him. And in Matthew 12, we see a classic two-quoque moment. The Pharisees accuse Jesus' disciples of breaking the Sabbath by picking grain. But what's their real motive here?
I mean, come on, they're not actually concerned about a few grains of wheat. They're trying to discredit Jesus.
Exactly. They're looking for anything to use against him, and instead of engaging with his teachings, they attack his disciples.
It's like they're saying, see, your followers aren't even following the rules. But it's a total deflection from the substance of Jesus' message.
Totally. It's a distraction tactic. They want to shift the focus away from their own potential issues and onto Jesus. It's all about power and control.
Yeah, and avoiding accountability. Which brings us to our next example, Cain and Abel. Talk about a story with some serious two-quoque vibes.
Oh, man, this one's a doozy. So Cain kills Abel, right?
Brutal.
And God asks him straight up, where is your brother? And Cain's response, am I my brother's keeper? Classic deflection.
It's like, dude, you literally just killed him. How can you even ask that question? But instead of taking responsibility, he tries to shift the blame. It's almost like he's trying to put God on the defensive.
Right. It's like, who are you to question me? Talk about avoiding the issue. It's a masterclass in deflection and denial. And speaking of denial, let's move on to the OG blame game. Adam and Eve.
Oh yeah, the original sinners.
They both eat the forbidden fruit, and when God confronts them, what happens? Blame shifting galore. Adam blames Eve. Eve blames the serpent. It's a chain reaction of two-quoque.
Right. It wasn't me, it was her. And oh yeah, it was that talking snake too.
Exactly. It's hilarious and tragic at the same time. But what I find really interesting here is that it goes beyond just blaming others. It's also about protecting their own egos.
Oh, absolutely. They're trying to preserve their self-image, even in the face of wrongdoing. It's like they can't handle the guilt, so they deflect it outwards.
Right. It's easier to point fingers than to own up to your mistakes. And this need to protect our ego, to avoid looking bad, it's something we all struggle with, right? It's a very human thing.
Totally. I mean, who wants to admit they messed up? It's way more comfortable to shift the blame, make excuses, justify our actions.
And it plays out on a much larger scale, too. Think about how often this you too mentality dominates political discourse.
Oh, for sure. It's like a constant game of gotcha. Politicians are always trying to expose each other's hypocrisy, but it rarely leads to any meaningful progress.
Exactly. It's just a distraction, and it prevents us from having honest conversations about the issues that really matter.
Okay.
One more biblical example, and this one really highlights the strategic use of two-quoque. The story of the woman caught in adultery.
Oh, yeah, this is a good one. So the scribes and Pharisees bring this woman before Jesus, hoping to trap him in a dilemma.
They're not actually concerned about her sin, are they? They're just trying to use her as a pawn in their game against Jesus.
Totally. They want to expose what they see as hypocrisy in his teachings. Like, if you're so merciful, why don't you let her go free? But of course, they're conveniently ignoring their own sins.
Right. It's a total setup. They're trying to force Jesus into a corner, knowing that whatever he does, they can use it against him.
It's a classic example of how the two-quote fallacy can be weaponized.
Exactly. It's not about justice or truth. It's about power and manipulation. So, as you can see, this fallacy is deeply rooted in human nature. It pops up everywhere. But here's the thing. The Bible doesn't just give us examples of the two-quote fallacy. It also strongly condemns hypocrisy and deflection.
Right. That's super important to note. The Bible is full of warnings against judging others while ignoring our own faults.
Yeah, and it calls us to a higher standard, to be honest and accountable for our own actions. And we'll dive deeper into those biblical teachings in the next part of our deep dive. Okay, so we've seen how the two-quoque fallacy plays out in all sorts of situations, from biblical stories to everyday arguments. But now I'm curious about the practical side of things. Like, how do we actually deal with this fallacy in real life? It feels like it can be so hard to counter, especially when you're in the heat of the moment.
Oh, absolutely. It can be really tricky. But the good news is there are some effective strategies we can use. One of the simplest is just to reframe the conversation. Instead of getting defensive, acknowledge their point, but gently steer things back to the main issue.
So it's like saying, yeah, you might have a point there, but that doesn't change the fact that...
Exactly. You're not denying their observation, but you're also not letting it derail the whole discussion.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about those situations where the accusation of hypocrisy is totally irrelevant to the actual argument? Like, how do you even respond to that? It feels like it should just be dismissed, but I'm never sure how to do that gracefully.
Yeah, I get that. It can be tempting to just roll your eyes and move on, but there's a way to address it without being dismissive. You can try saying something like, I understand you might disagree with my past actions, but I don't see how that's relevant to the point I'm making now.
So you're acknowledging their point, but also drawing a clear boundary. It's like saying, let's stick to the topic at hand.
Exactly. It's about redirecting the conversation in a respectful but firm way. Because ultimately, the two-quoque fallacy is a distraction tactic.
Right. It's about shifting the focus away from the real issue. But I gotta admit, it can be hard not to get defensive when someone throws the two-quoque at you. Like, it feels like a personal attack, even if it's not intended that way.
Oh, for sure. Our natural instinct is to protect ourselves when we feel attacked. But if we can take a moment to breathe and choose to respond thoughtfully instead of reacting emotionally, it can make a huge difference.
It's like choosing to be the bigger person, even if it's hard.
Exactly. And it often leads to a more productive conversation in the end. Because when you stay calm and focused on the issue, it shows that you're genuinely interested in finding a solution.
Okay, so we've talked about reframing the conversation, drawing boundaries, and staying calm. Any other tips for handling two quoque in real life?
Well, this one might be the toughest, but it's crucial. Sometimes you have to be willing to acknowledge your own imperfections.
Ooh, that's a tough one. No one likes to admit they're wrong.
I know, right? But it can be so disarming when you're willing to own up to your mistakes. It shows that you're not trying to be perfect, and it makes you more relatable.
So it's like saying, yeah, you're right, I've messed up in the past, but that doesn't mean I'm wrong about this.
Exactly. It takes the wind out of their sails because they're expecting you to get defensive.
Okay, that's really helpful. But what about those situations where the person using two quoque is someone in a position of authority, like your boss or your parents? It feels a lot harder to challenge them directly.
Yeah, I get that. It definitely requires more finesse. You don't want to be disrespectful, but you also don't want to let them manipulate you.
So what do you do?
You can still address the fallacy, but in a more subtle way. You can say something like, I understand your perspective, and I'm definitely working on learning from my past mistakes. But I think the issue we're discussing right now deserves our full attention.
So you're acknowledging their authority, but also subtly pointing out the fallacy.
Exactly. It's a delicate balance, but it's possible to stand your ground without being confrontational.
Okay, that's good to know. But let's shift gears for a moment and talk about the bigger picture here. We touched on this earlier with the example of politics, but I think it goes even deeper than that. It's like this two quoque mentality has infected our entire culture.
Oh, totally. It's become this pervasive pattern of deflecting blame and refusing to take responsibility. We see it everywhere, in the media, on social media, even in our personal relationships.
It's like we're constantly looking for ways to justify our own behavior while pointing fingers at everyone else. It's exhausting.
It really is, and it creates this toxic environment where no one can ever be wrong and no one ever have to apologize.
Right. It's like we're all trapped in this giant game of gotcha. But what's really scary is how this impacts our ability to have meaningful conversations about important issues.
Absolutely. It creates this climate of distrust and cynicism where everyone is so focused on exposing hypocrisy that we lose sight of the bigger picture. It's like, can we just have an honest conversation for once without all the drama and finger pointing?
Right. It's like we've lost the ability to disagree respectfully, to learn from each other, to actually make progress together. So, what's the antidote to this two-quoque epidemic? Is there any hope for breaking free from this cycle of blame and deflection? It's starting to feel like this is just how humans are wired.
I think there is hope, but it requires a conscious effort. It starts with awareness. We need to be able to recognize this fallacy when we see it, both in others and in ourselves, and then we have to be willing to call it out.
It sounds like it takes a lot of courage and self-awareness.
It does. But I truly believe it's worth it, because when we start challenging this fallacy, we open up the possibility for more honest and productive conversations.
So it's not just about winning arguments, it's about actually connecting with each other and trying to understand different perspectives.
Exactly. It's about shifting our focus from being right to actually learning and growing.
And maybe that's the key to overcoming this tu quoque obsession. Maybe it's about realizing that we're all flawed human beings and it's okay to make mistakes.
Rolly. We don't have to be perfect all the time. What matters is that we're willing to learn and grow.
Okay, that's a good place to pause for now. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into the two quoque fallacy. We'll be right back to wrap up our discussion with some final thoughts and takeaways. And we're back, wrapping things up on our deep dive into the two quoque fallacy. It's been a fascinating look at this age-old tactic, and honestly, a little bit disheartening to see how common it still is.
Yeah, I agree. It kind of makes you wonder, are we really any better at arguing than our ancestors from thousands of years ago?
Right, like haven't we evolved past this? But I guess the encouraging thing is at least now we're able to recognize it, right? We're starting to understand how this fallacy works, how it can derail conversations, and how we can counter it.
Exactly. Awareness is the first step. And I think this deep dive has been really helpful in raising that awareness. But now the question is, what do we do with this knowledge? How do we actually create a culture where two quoque loses its power?
Yeah, that's the big challenge, isn't it? Like, how do we move beyond this constant finger pointing and actually start having productive conversations?
It's tough, I'll admit, especially in today's world where everything feels so polarized and everyone's just waiting to pounce on each other's mistakes. But I do think it's possible. I really do.
Okay, I'm listening. Give me some hope here. What can we actually do?
Well, I think it starts with individual choices. Like, we can all make a conscious effort to recognize two quoque when we see it, both in others and in ourselves, and we can resist the temptation to use it.
So it's about leading by example, basically.
Exactly. Because when we start changing our own behavior, it can have a ripple effect on those around us. Like, if you're in an argument and you resist the urge to throw out a two quoque, it could actually shift the whole dynamic of the conversation.
I see what you mean. It's like breaking the cycle. But it also sounds really hard, to be honest, especially when you're feeling attacked or defensive.
Oh, it definitely takes practice. And it's not about being perfect. It's about progress, Like, each time we choose to respond thoughtfully instead of reacting impulsively, it's a win.
Okay, so let's say we're all on board with this idea of resisting tu quoque. What else can we do to create a more constructive communication culture?
I think it's also about promoting a culture of accountability, like being willing to own up to our mistakes, to apologize when we're wrong, to actually learn from our screw-ups.
Yeah, that makes sense because tu quoque is all about deflecting accountability, right? It's about avoiding responsibility for our actions.
Exactly. So if we can start to normalize the idea of taking ownership, it can really change things. It can create a space where people feel safe to admit their mistakes and actually grow from them.
Okay, I like that. It's about creating a culture of grace and understanding rather than one of judgment and blame.
Precisely. And I think that's something we can all strive for, both in our personal lives and in the larger world.
So to our listeners out there, I hope you've learned something from this deep dive into the two quoque fallacy, and I hope you're feeling empowered to spot it, to counter it, and maybe even to help create that more grace-filled world we were just talking about.
Yeah, let's all try to be a little more mindful of how we argue and a little more forgiving of each other's imperfections.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Until next time, keep those minds sharp, everyone.